Welcome back, and this is part two of the exploration of my favorite comic book character ever, the Shadow. Now, in the books that Walter Gibson wrote, he was not a psychic individual. He was a man who had, honed his strength to basically work off of the shadows that surrounded him. He obviously only plied his trade in darkness, and then, but he could move so quickly that it would seem as though he was moving just in between shadows, so he could not really be seen until you heard the bark of his twin 45s, in which case you were more than likely dead. You know, gangsters, mostly gangsters, smugglers, saboteurs, none of them escaped his vengeance, and the Shadow never failed. Now, when the radio show started, well, they thought of a different take on that because, times were a little bit different back in the 1930s. It wasn't so much that they were anti-violence, because, believe me, if you hear some of the broadcasts of the Shadow radio show, a lot of people die. Lots of people die. In one episode, for instance, there's an episode called Poison Death, in which I think literally hundreds of New Yorkers die. Because somebody poisons one of the reservoirs. But they, it was more of a detective story than it was a story about, vengeance and justice. So what they did is they took the guns and pretty much almost all physical contact out of the character, and they made him a man who, while he was in the Orient, they don't say where, learned a strange and mysterious secret, the hypnotic power to cloud men's minds so they could not see him. And Cranston had a friend, his lovely companion Margot Lane, who was kind of his gal Friday, essentially. Now, this was mostly on the radio show, but this character also did appear in the novels as well. Again, in the novels and the radio show, there were very distinct differences. Like I said, in the radio show, Lamont Cranston was just Lamont Cranston. You never really learned about his past. In the books, he is, someone who is pretending to be Lamont. Kent Allard is a man who is pretending to be Lamont Cranston, and he has no hypnotic powers whatsoever. Instead they used the idea of this disembodied voice, who's essentially echoed in this very like I said, this very mirthless laugh, a laugh that's that just curdled your blood when you heard it. So he was never seen, only heard. As inevitable as a guilty conscience. So, he, and in the radio show, he hunted down murderers and gangsters and thugs and killers, but he never physically did anything to them. He would either, frighten them so bad so that one or the other would take their lives, whatever. It's just a lot of suicides for the bad guys in these shows, and a couple times obviously they were caught by the authorities, and it was always the Shadow that ended up saving the day when it came to these big mysteries. Much to the chagrin of the police commissioner Weston, who just did not like the Shadow, but he was actually friends with Cranston and Margot Lane. So basically, now this is going to, so we're going to skip forward several decades. Well, not several, but a few. And in 1973, two very exciting and talented people revitalized the Shadow in the 4-color format. And this is a collection of some of their works. See here, The Private Files of the Shadow, and written by Dennis O'Neil and illustrated by Michael William Kaluta. Now, Denny O'Neil was the man primarily responsible for bringing Batman back from the brink of total camp into the Dark Knight detective that he became in the late 60s and early 70s. And this book, it collects many of the Shadow stories that were done by O'Neil and Kaluta. However, the comic itself, this particular incarnation of the Shadow, only lasted, I think, 10 issues, which was sad, but most of them are here because it's pretty much exclusive to the work of O'Neil and Kaluta, although Kaluta wasn't always the artist on all the issues of the of all of these characters, because in some issues the illustration was done by Frank Robbins. So I'm sorry, it was 12 issues, and people like Frank Robbins and illustrator Bernie Wrightson, who's one of the great artists of all time, did work on this comic book, but like I said, only lasting 12 issues. So it appeared that the 70s were just not ready for, a pulp hero from, the 20s and 30s. Sad, but unfortunately true. Now, a couple of years later, when the advent of the graphic novel came around, for some reason or another, Marvel acquired the rights briefly to the character of the Shadow, and they published this, which was one of the first of the original graphic novel series from Marvel Comics. So this was, essentially this was from this was actually from 1988, so it was a while. It elaborates on the in the other incarnations of the Shadow, he never really fought the Nazis, but this is very specific. He is fighting the Nazis in this particular story. And Kaluta really captured the look of the Shadow almost, pretty much perfectly. His is the definitive work. What was so interesting and exciting about the Shadow comic book, and this is something that O'Neil himself said about writing the Shadow, is that he wasn't in favor of, the Shadow wasn't a champion of the death penalty. The Shadow was the death penalty, which is not to say that he's like the Punisher in that respect. He's not like them. They are two very different characters. The Shadow believes in meting out justice to those who absolutely deserve it. There are some that are below his wrath, that he just does knock out, but there are some definitely that, that get the twin 45s, and the Shadow never fails. So we're going to come back just after the jump with another chapter, and essentially is the present state of the Shadow. So be right back.